Successes, Failures, and Implications of the Civil Rights Movement by Matt Majay, Andrew Kaminsky, and James Weitzel. Civil Rights Successes. The Civil Rights Movement established many of the reformations necessary to enable the African American community to integrate and eventually thrive within the United States. Many of the setbacks dealt with a lack of opportunity for African Americans in their respective precinct of America. The Virginia Historical Society states that the Civil Rights Movement was a heroic endeavor for the African American community, and through multiple legislative battles, blacks were able to gain the full rights and benefits of citizenship that many whites took for granted. One of the initial and foremost policies of the Civil Rights Movement was Brown versus Board, in which the Supreme Court ruled that segregation in public schools was undeniably unconstitutional. Not only did this break down previous separate but equal sentiments, but in cases such as Plessy versus Ferguson, it gave young African Americans the opportunity to properly educate themselves and gain the opportunity to achieve a potential outside of the sharecropping occupations within the South. Yet another seemingly minutiae within the Civil Rights Movement, Rosa Parks' protest of the Montgomery bus system created a precedent for further protests against segregation. Though outwardly arbitrary, in reality, Parks' refusal of segregation was a systematic approach by the NAACP to break down Southern racism and violence through media attention and eventually national recognition of these injustices. Perhaps the most paramount and greatest example of support and solidarity within the Civil Rights Movement took place during the March on Washington, which established bills such as the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. These policies eliminated legally discriminative ideals within the country and gave African Americans full right to vote and work. This represents the peak of success for the Civil Rights Movement. However, as the influence of peaceful resistance spurred by Martin Luther King began to decline, the Civil Rights Movement eventually began to lose its original and most effective purpose of integration. The Civil Rights Movement raised awareness of these injustices and politically seemed rather successful. On paper, minorities were all had equal opportunity in society, yet as more and more of the press and politicians took their side in legislature, the more resentment occurred between the minorities and the majorities. Tensions were always rather high between the racist whites and African Americans, but Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolence movements established this ideology of inclusion. But with his assassination, his nonviolence movements had begun to break down. Preachers of black separatism and rather violent ideologies influenced by Malcolm X caused riots and a sense of black pride among the black community. This independence led to similar movements among minorities in the same violent manner. These radical ideas escalated the tensions between the white racists who continued to terrorize the minority population. Cities increasingly became more and more segregated, and racist communities argued for seclusion, and blacks answered back with black pride. Racism increased with the passage of more laws protecting minorities. All in all, the 20th century civil rights movement proved to be successful in gaining more rights for blacks and stunting the growth of racism. While subtle forms of racism are still prevalent in our society, the fact that integration was achieved proves that the overall point of the movement was successful. Today, the civil rights movement has greatly affected the development of the educational system, with the enforcement of principles set forth in Brown versus Board of Education. Segregation in schools ceased and allowed for a more educated black community to form, given the same schooling conditions that whites had. The other main impact that civil rights movement had on today was the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1964, which passed as a result of the March on Washington. This gave suffrage rights to blacks and has added a new facet to the voting system. With a new demographic of people now able to vote, a more complete, equal voting system was created. The leadership set forth by civil rights advocates such as Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King have inspired generations and caused a new sense of Black pride in America. The progress made in the 1960s regarding the civil rights movements allowed people to transcend racial boundaries and to become a more unified community.